Now, my name is Jenna. I'm one of the young adults here at Warwick, and I get the joy of speaking to you all today. I just want to say it's really cool to see how many people are serving for the first time today, being at First Serve Sunday. Now, when I first said yes to speaking today, it was unknown to me at the time that I could rather be serving in the comfort and the safety of the cafe instead of on stage, but here we are. All jokes aside, I'm actually really excited to be able to share with you today as we jump into a new series. Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be looking into the book of Esther. Now, if you haven't read this book before, it is quite a curious book in the Old Testament, being the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God once. Yet this leaves us with an awesome invitation to look for God's activity throughout the story and see how his purposes are unfolding behind the scenes, even when it seems that he is invisible. Now, this morning we're specifically going to have a look at chapter 3 in the book of Esther, and it follows a character named Haman. Now, Haman is the antagonist in our story. He exemplifies the character of pride. And as the story unfolds, we not only see what his pride does within his own heart, but the damage and the destruction that it brings to those around him. But before we dive right in, I'm going to bring you up to speed in the story leading up to Haman. Now, the book of Esther reads somewhat like a high-stakes period drama. We have political intrigue, we have royal power plays, there's life and death situations. But I'm going to paint a picture for you, and I encourage you to go home later and read through chapters 1 to 3 yourself. How does that sound? All right, buckle in. So, the book of Esther starts by introducing us to the great empire of King Xerxes, the king of Persia. Now, he rules 127 provinces from Asia to ancient Kush, which is modern-day Sudan. What is more, Xerxes knew how to throw a party. In an event extending over 180 days, he displays the vast wealth of his kingdom. And after 6 months of celebration, he throws another 7-day banquet for all the people, from the greatest to the least. There were hangings of white and linen in the garden. There's couches of silver and gold. Wine was free flowing, each guest allowed to drink without restriction as to the king's instruction. Straight away, we are painted a picture of Xerxes' overwhelming power and exaltation above the people of Susa. Now, on the final day of the banquet, King Xerxes commands his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to parade her beauty in front of all the nobles and the officials. Yet she refuses to come. Now the king is furious with Vashti, and after consulting with wise men on matters of the law, he issues a decree that forbid Vashti ever entering the presence of the king again. And what is more, he would give her royal position to someone who he thinks is better than she. She was stripped of her crown. In the story that follows, he then holds somewhat of a beauty pageant to find his new queen. And it's right here in the story that we are introduced to 2 Jews, Esther and Mordecai. We learn that Mordecai is a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, whose ancestors were carried into exile from Jerusalem. Mordecai has a younger cousin, Esther, who is the protagonist in our story and who he had raised from young as she was an orphan. Esther's Hebrew name is Hadassah, yet she goes by Esther to keep her Jewish identity hidden. Now, Esther, being a beautiful young woman and hiding her Jewish identity, she enters into this beauty pageant and wins the king's favor, making her queen instead of Vashti. Now, after all this, Mordecai just happens to hear 2 royal guards plotting to kill the king. So Mordecai informs Esther, the new queen, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. Whew, you can take a deep breath now. That was a lot. Are we still following? Who knew we'd get a soap opera in the Bible? Now, it's important to note at this point that the Jews at the time were living in somewhat of a precarious position. scattered throughout Persia. The story takes place about 100 years after Babylonian exile, and while many had returned to Jerusalem, many remained scattered throughout Persia. Now, the Persian Empire was the new powerhouse of the ancient world, and as we see through the book, the Jews were subject to this vast power that eventually leads to the threat of genocide of the entire Jewish population. Now, if you're following along, we'll pick up in chapter 3 where we are introduced to Haman. Now, in Haman, we see this ultimate character of pride, and through his plot to destroy the Jews, to wipe out all of the Jews in Persia, we see not only what happens when we let pride rage unchecked in our lives, but also how pride can blind someone to their downfall. Starting in verse 1, it says this: After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. Now, straight off the bat, Haman is introduced into this story, and often in the Bible, a character's introduction is important to set up their role within the story. We learn that he is not a Persian, he's an Agagite, a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. And we are told that the king has elevated him to the highest position in the kingdom and demands that everyone kneel before him. Straight away, we know that Haman is someone who has authority over the people, and he has a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. He's in a position above everyone and would expect to be treated as such. The king commands everyone kneel down before Haman, yet one man wouldn't do it: Mordecai, the cousin of Esther. Now, we aren't told why Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman. It could be because of religious motivation. He was a Jew and he wouldn't bow down before a man. Or it could be because Haman was an Agagite and Mordecai a Benjamite, and there was a fierce hatred between these ancestral enemies. Yet rather focusing on why he doesn't bow down, I want us to look on how Haman reacts to Mordecai's refusal. Picking up in verse 5, it says, "When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes." Now, before we continue on, let's have a look at the character of pride. Pride, according to the Bible, is the concentration on the self, or the absorption in the self. Now, when we look at Haman, we can see a certain amount of pride present in his heart. Now, we know he holds a high position above all the other nobles. He would hold himself in a rather high esteem. Yet we see he's not purely satisfied with his achievements. His pride is rooted in the way that people perceive him. He doesn't just want the status, he wants people to acknowledge that status too. So when one man refuses to do so, Haman is blinded with rage. Mordecai's behavior is galling to Haman because in spite of his great power and his position, he doesn't get the approval that he believes he's deserving of. At one point later, chapter 5, Haman is boasting to his wife and his friends of his vast wealth and his position and how the king has elevated him above everyone else. And he says, "But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." He's furious. Haman is so blinded by his pride that in his position of power, he sees it fit to destroy a whole community for what he considers one person's disrespect. And what he does next in verse 8, it says, "Then Haman said to King Xerxes, 'There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them all, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury.'" Haman successfully persuades King Xerxes to enact this crazy decree to destroy all the Jewish people. And having rolled a dice called Pour, 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, the date of the Jews' annihilation was decided. The chapter ends in verse 15, and it says, "The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered." Through this chapter and continuing on in the book of Esther, we see what the character of pride does to a person's heart. What one's need for exaltation, their grasp for status and honor, that can blind their heart and lead them down a road of destruction. Proverbs 16 verse 8 tells us, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." And this proverb not only paints a picture of what is happening in this story as Haman plots to destroy the Jews, but foreshadows the fall that is to come as a consequence of his actions and the condition of his heart. Now, it's easy for us to look at Haman and identify his pride. For as we find it easy to see pride in others, we can often fail to find it in ourselves. So how can we follow that back until it becomes a point of tension in our lives? So last weekend, as most of you will know, our young adults went down to Bunbury for State Youth Games, and we represented the church in a wide variety of sports. We had basketball, we had badminton, we had volleyball, ultimate frisbee, the list goes on. Yet there was one sport that I was most excited for. Now, it was its first appearance at State Youth Games, and there was a bit of controversy around the fact of if it was even a sport or not. Does anyone have any idea what this sport would be? Yeah, that's right. Speed puzzling, and it is a sport. Now, as someone who used to work in a game store, as someone who has worked at jigsaw competitions before, and I've completed many jigsaws, I thought I had this win in the bag. I told just about anyone who would listen that I was taking home number one. Now, the competition was done in pairs. We had a 500-piece puzzle, and the team that finished in the quickest time won. So Hannah and I, we were in a team together. We had team meetings, we had discussions, we had a plan of action, and we rocked up to this competition as if we had already won. As we're scanning, our competitors were thinking they have no idea what is coming their way. Now, the competition starts, and Hannah and I are locked in on our jigsaw. It's a bluey jigsaw. We've got about 100 bluey characters to match. And we're thinking we're going pretty strong. Looking at the tables around us, there's a bit of competition, but we think we've got it in the bag. And just as we think all is well, someone from far across the room puts up their hand and yells, "Finished." Now, I'm looking at our puzzle and thinking, how on earth had they already finished? Now, we managed to pull ourselves back together. It's okay. Second place is still good. We can do it. And then another hand goes up, and they finished. But it's fine because we've still got third, still on the leaderboard, and then that goes too. And finally, when we finish our puzzle, we come in 7th place, 30 minutes behind the winner. It was a brutal loss. I tried to play it off cool, but I was heartbroken. But the fact of the matter is I entered that competition with a certain amount of pride. In my heart, I'd already placed myself above my competitors. I believed that I was going to beat them all. Now, maybe if I didn't go in with so much pride, I would have seen how strange we looked to our competitors when we walked in with baking trays as sorting containers. My pride had blinded me to actually see my competitors because I had already placed myself above them. The winners, who were completely dismissed by me at the beginning, weren't boasting of their talent, but had silently risen to the top. See, pride by nature is competitive. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, but out of having more of it than the next person. My pride wasn't rooted in winning a puzzle competition, it was rooted in the belief that I was better than my competitors. Just as Haman didn't have any satisfaction in his status, he wanted people to recognize and honor that status. The fact is that where there is pride, we always set ourselves up for a fall. And when we see ourselves more highly than we ought to, we become blind to the people around us. When the Pharisees asked Jesus, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. And the second is this, love your neighbor as yourself." Yet how do we love our neighbors as ourselves when we've already placed ourselves above them? How can we treat someone as our equal when in our hearts we are already looking down? We've seen that pride can blind our hearts to the people and the needs around us, that in our pride, our power can make us feel bigger and the people around us start to look smaller. Yet our pride doesn't just impact ourselves and the people around us, it also leads our heart away from dependence on God. It threatens and it hinders our intimacy with God. The desire to lift up and exalt ourselves beyond our place lies at its heart. And when we place ourselves at the center of our world, we move God to the periphery. We don't often see that shift though. Sometimes we don't recognize how deadly the vice of pride is because it can be so hidden. Maybe we started out at a place where God was at the center of our lives, yet when life started to get comfortable, we became complacent to the blessings that He gave us. And in our complacency, we stopped saying, "Jesus, I need you," and we started saying, "I've got this." And the illusion of self-reliance stops us from relying on the grace of God, and in doing so, we sideline Him. Instead of Jesus at the center of our lives, the one who is faithful and the perfecter of our faith, we look to ourselves for our strength. And slowly but surely, our pride creates distance between us and God. Now, in ancient Persia, Haman and King Xerxes have just sat down for a drink after sending out a decree for the annihilation of all the Jews across the Persian Empire. And in the very next verse, we get a glimpse of Mordecai's response to this devastating news. Chapter 4, verse 1 reads, "When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly." Typically in the Bible, when we see someone don the sackcloth and ashes, it is usually deeply symbolic of humility and repentance before God. The sackcloth and ashes is an outward sign of the inward condition of the heart. At the time, for all the Jews, all was seemingly lost. The date of their destruction had been set, and once a royal decree had been written in the laws of Persia and Media, it could not be repealed. The Jews were facing the threat of complete genocide, with no hope of saving themselves, and the only response left was to look to the one who could. To humble ourselves before God is to recognize that we are not the heroes of our story. It means that instead of trying to control every outcome, every situation, we can surrender our control to God and trust that He is the one leading our steps. A famous quote from C.S. Lewis that many of you may have heard before is this: "If anyone would like to acquire humility," wrong one. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. And when we are thinking of ourselves less, it allows us to focus on serving and loving others more. He goes on to say, if anyone would like to acquire humility, the first step is to realize that one is proud. Now, before I close, I just want to challenge you to wrestle with how do you respond to different situations in your life? Do you face them leading with pride or with humility? Because not only does that decision affect the outcome of the situation, but it deeply affects the condition of our hearts. And maybe you're like me, and pride can be something that is difficult to locate in your life. I've got a couple questions that were helpful for me to find that point of tension in my life. And if you want, you can use them to try and help identify hidden pride in your life, or rather, you can just use them as a reminder of how easy it is for pride to go unnoticed in seemingly normal scenarios. And the questions are these: do I struggle to apologize when I'm in the wrong? How well do I receive criticism or correction? Am I quick to pass the blame? Do I tend to compare myself and my achievement with others? And do I find myself lacking gratitude in my prayer life with God?